Most people imagine the worst horrors in Nazi camps were carried out by men, but behind the fences and watchtowers, young women stepped into roles that gave them power over life and death. And some of these women used that authority to execute in ways so brutal that it still shocks the world today. It all started to shift after World War II began in September 1939, when Nazi Germany invaded Poland and triggered a chain reaction across Europe. Within months, and then years, German forces pushed into countries like France in 1940, the Netherlands, Belgium, and deep into Eastern Europe after the 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union. As this expansion grew, the Nazi regime didn't just take land. It started rounding up people on a massive scale. Jews were the main target under the Nazi racial laws, but they weren't the only ones. Political opponents, resistance fighters, Roma families, Soviet prisoners of war, and even ordinary civilians accused of small acts of disobedience were arrested. At first, arrests were more controlled, but as the war intensified, the system became more aggressive and chaotic. By the early 1940s, the number of prisoners had exploded from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands, and then into the millions across the entire camp network. Existing camps like Dachau and Sachsenhausen were already overcrowded, so the Nazis had to build new ones and expand older ones to keep up. One of the most important additions to this system was Ravensbrück concentration camp, which opened in 1939 and quickly became the main camp for women. It was located about 90 kilometers north of Berlin, and unlike earlier camps that mostly held male prisoners, Ravensbrück was dedicated specifically to imprison women, including many from occupied countries like Poland, France, and the Soviet Union. Over time, more than 130,000 women passed through this camp, and thousands died there due to executions, forced labor, starvation, and medical experiments. Because the prisoners were mostly female, the Nazi leadership decided they needed female guards to control them, both for practical reasons and because they believed women guards would better manage women prisoners. This created a completely new role inside the SS system. And suddenly, there was a demand for large numbers of female personnel. To fill this gap, the Nazis began recruiting women from across Germany. These weren't trained soldiers or experienced officers. Most came from ordinary backgrounds. Some worked in factories, others were clerks, shop assistants, or unemployed due to the war economy. A number of them responded to job advertisements that presented the position as stable work with benefits like regular pay, food rations, uniforms, and housing, which were valuable during wartime shortages. For many, it didn't look like a dangerous or violent job at first. It looked like an opportunity. But once they entered the SS system and were sent for training, everything changed quickly. The center of all this was Ravensbrück concentration camp itself, and very quickly it became something much bigger than just a place to hold prisoners. It turned into the main training ground for the female SS guards, known as Aufsichtsrätinnen. And this training didn't happen in classrooms or separate facilities. It happened right there inside the camp, surrounded by real prisoners. From 1939 into the early 1940s, thousands of women were brought in, and many of them learned the job by watching and copying what other guards were already doing. That's what made it so dangerous. This wasn't theory or practice drills. New recruits were standing in the middle of a working concentration camp, seeing people being punished, beaten, and sometimes killed, and being told that this was normal. They learned how to control large groups of prisoners, how to shout orders, how to use physical force, and most importantly, how to use fear as a constant tool. Fear wasn't just part of the system, it was the system. Guards were encouraged to make examples out of prisoners so that everyone else would stay in line without resistance. Officially, they were told their job was to maintain discipline and order. But in reality, the line between discipline and cruelty disappeared very quickly. The system gave guards a huge amount of freedom, and there was very little supervision over how they carried out their duties, especially as the war went on and the camp system expanded. Executions became part of the environment, not always as formal events, but as something that could happen at any time. Some killings were ordered from higher command, especially if a prisoner was accused of resistance, sabotage, or trying to escape. But many others were decided in the moment by the guards themselves. A prisoner could be beaten for walking too slowly during roll call, for collapsing during forced labor, or even for making eye contact at the wrong time. In some cases, those beatings didn't stop until the person died. The power given to guards was almost absolute inside the camp, and without any real accountability, that power could be used however they wanted. This kind of environment had a strong effect on people, especially younger recruits who are trying to prove themselves and fit into the system. One of the clearest examples is Irma Greza, who joined the SS as a teenager, around 19 years old. She went through training at Ravensbrück before being sent to Auschwitz concentration camp and later Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Despite her young age, she quickly developed a reputation for being extremely harsh. Survivors later described how she used physical violence regularly and seemed to go beyond what was required, as if she was trying to stand out. In a system like this, showing strictness and aggression could lead to recognition or promotion, so some guards pushed themselves to be even more brutal. But what's important to understand is that she wasn't some isolated case. She came out of a system that trained people this way, rewarded this behavior, and rarely punished it. Ravensbrück didn't just produce guards who followed orders step by step. It created an environment where cruelty could be seen as strength, and where being feared could be seen as success. New guards learned quickly that the more control they showed, the more seriously they were taken. And once they completed their training, they were sent out across the growing network of camps in Nazi-controlled Europe, including places like Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, carrying that same mindset with them. By the time many of these guards arrived at places like the Auschwitz concentration camp, the system was already operating at full scale, and executions were happening in many different forms. Gas chambers or firing squads were widely used, especially in extermination camps. But inside the daily life of the camps, especially in areas controlled directly by guards, the killings were often much more personal and drawn out. Female guards played a direct role in this. During selections, prisoners were lined up and inspected, often after long hours of forced labor. Guards, including women like Irma Greza, would help decide who was still fit to work and who was not. Those judged too weak were sent away, often to their deaths, sometimes within hours. But outside of these organized selections, many killings happened in smaller, more immediate ways. Beatings were common. Guards used whatever they had, including sticks, whips, or just their boots to punish prisoners. And sometimes those beatings didn't stop until the person died. These acts were often carried out in front of others, turning them into a warning. Starvation was another method that didn't always look like an execution at first, but had the same result. Prisoners could be locked in cells or left without food and water as punishment, slowly weakening until their bodies gave out. This could take days, and there was no attempt to hide it. Hangings were also used, sometimes with makeshift gallows built inside the camp area. Prisoners were forced to watch, which added another layer of fear and control. And then there were shootings, which could happen at any moment. Guards often carried pistols, and if a prisoner collapsed from exhaustion during work or a march, they could be shot immediately without any formal order. Over time, this constant exposure to violence changed how guards saw their actions. What could have once been shocking became normal. Killing wasn't seen as something extreme anymore. It was just another part of the daily routine inside the camp system. While many female guards worked inside camps carrying out daily duties, a few names stood out because of how far their cruelty went. And one of the most talked about was Ilse Koch. She wasn't officially trained as a standard SS guard like the women at Ravensbrück, but she held serious influence because she was married to Karl Koch, the commandant of Buchenwald concentration camp. That position gave her access, power, and freedom inside the camp, and she used it in ways that made her feared by prisoners, and even known among SS circles. She arrived at Buchenwald in 1937, and over the next few years, her presence became tied to punishment, fear, and humiliation. Survivors later described how she would walk through the camp, sometimes on horseback, watching prisoners closely, looking for any reason to punish someone. It didn't take much. A glance, a small mistake, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time could lead to severe consequences. What made her role especially disturbing was how she encouraged a culture where cruelty wasn't just accepted, it was pushed further. Guards under her influence often carried out punishments that went beyond orders. Prisoners could be beaten publicly, whipped, or forced into degrading situations before being killed, turning executions into something meant to break not just the body, but the spirit. In many cases, the goal wasn't a quick death. It was to strip away dignity first, to make an example out of someone so that everyone else would live in constant fear. There were also widespread survivor claims that she took a special interest in prisoners with tattoos, allegedly having them targeted, which added another layer of terror among inmates who already had no control over their situation. Whether every detail of these claims was proven or not, the fear they created was very real, and that fear shaped daily life inside the camp. Inside Buchenwald concentration camp, this kind of behavior didn't stay limited to one person. When someone in a position of power acts this way and faces no consequences, it sends a message to everyone else. Other guards and officials began acting more aggressively, knowing that brutality was not only allowed, but often rewarded or ignored. New guards entering the camp would see this behavior and quickly adapt to it, thinking this was how things were supposed to be done. By late 1944 and into early 1945, everything inside Nazi Germany was starting to fall apart as World War II turned against them. Allied forces were pushing in from both sides, with Soviet troops coming from the east and British and American forces moving in from the west. This pressure didn't just affect the front lines, it reached deep into the concentration camp system. Camps that were already overcrowded suddenly received even more prisoners as the Nazis evacuated camps in Poland and other eastern areas to keep them from being liberated. Places like Bergen-Belsen concentration camp saw massive increases in prisoner numbers within weeks. Tens of thousands of people were crammed into spaces that were never designed to hold that many. Food supplies were breaking down, clean water was limited, and basic sanitation almost disappeared. The system that had once been tightly controlled started to crack under the pressure. And when systems like this start breaking, the people inside them often become more dangerous, not less. Guards, including many female guards who had been trained in earlier years, were now dealing with chaos, fear, and uncertainty. They knew the war was being lost. They had heard rumors of what Allied forces were finding in liberated camps. Many of them understood that they could be held responsible for what they'd done. That fear changed their behavior. Instead of pulling back, many became even more aggressive. Violence became a way to maintain control in a situation that was slipping out of their hands. Executions increased, not always through formal orders, but through sudden acts of punishment, shootings, and beatings that could happen at any moment. Inside Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, conditions reached a level that shocked even hardened soldiers. By early 1945, the camp held over 60,000 prisoners, far beyond its capacity. Food shipments had almost stopped completely, and disease spread quickly through the overcrowded barracks. Typhus became especially deadly, killing thousands in a short time. Bodies were left unburied for days because there were not enough people strong enough to carry them. Many prisoners died without any formal execution at all, simply from starvation, sickness, or exhaustion. But at the same time, guards still continued to carry out killings. People who tried to find food, who moved too slowly, or who broke rules could still be beaten or shot. The system didn't stop being violent just because it was collapsing. In many ways, it became even more unpredictable. As Allied forces got closer, the Nazis began evacuating camps to avoid prisoners being freed. This led to what became known as death marches. Prisoners were forced to walk long distances, often in freezing conditions, with little or no food. These marches could last for days or even weeks. Anyone who couldn't keep up was seen as useless. Guards, including female guards, were armed and ordered to keep the lines moving. If a prisoner stumbled, fell behind, or collapsed from exhaustion, they were often shot immediately on the roadside. There was no pause, no help, no second chance. The goal was to keep moving, no matter how many people died along the way. Female guards played a direct role in this. In April 1945, British troops reached Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, and what they walked into was beyond anything they expected, even after years of war. The camp had completely collapsed. There were tens of thousands of prisoners still alive, but barely. Many were lying on the ground, too weak to move, surrounded by bodies that had not been buried. Disease, especially typhus, had spread out of control, and the smell of death filled the entire area. British soldiers later described how the scene didn't look like a normal camp anymore. It looked like total breakdown. And what made it even more disturbing was that guards were still there when the camp was liberated. Some had tried to flee, but many were captured on the spot, including female guards who had been part of the system right up until the final days. Among them was Irma Greza, who had already built a reputation for brutality at both Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. Not long after the liberation, the British began organizing trials to deal with what they had uncovered. They needed to understand exactly what had happened inside the camps and who was responsible. This led to one of the first major war crimes trials held after the war, known as the Belsen trial, which started in September 1945 in the German city of Lüneburg. The trial included 45 defendants, both men and women, who had worked at Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz. This was one of the first times the world heard detailed, first-hand accounts of the daily reality inside the camps. Survivors were brought in to testify, and they described in clear detail the beatings, the shootings, the starvation punishments, and the public executions they had witnessed or experienced themselves. They didn't speak in general terms. They gave names, pointed out specific guards, and explained exactly what those people had done. For many outside observers, it was shocking, not just because of the scale of cruelty, but because of how direct and personal it often was. The evidence presented during the Belsen trial made it clear that female guards were not just passive participants. Several of them were found guilty of actively taking part in violence and killings. Some had used weapons, others had carried out brutal punishments that led to death, and many had enforced conditions that caused mass suffering. The court handed down different sentences depending on the level of involvement, but for some, the punishment was death. Irma Greza was among those sentenced to death. In December 1945, she was executed by hanging at Hamelin prison. She was only 22 years old at the time, which shocked many people because someone so young had played such a brutal role inside the camps. That moment stayed with a lot of people. It showed that those who had power inside the camps could be held accountable, even if they weren't high-ranking leaders. But for many survivors, the trials didn't feel like full justice. No sentence, no matter how severe, could bring back the people who had died or erase what had been done. The trials exposed the truth and punished some of those responsible, but they couldn't undo the suffering. What they did do, though, was make sure the world could no longer deny what had happened, and that the names and actions of those involved would be recorded and remembered. The actions of female guards didn't end in 1945. Their stories became part of a larger understanding of how ordinary people can commit extraordinary cruelty. Today, places like Auschwitz concentration camp and Ravensbrück concentration camp stand as reminders, not just of what happened, but of what can happen again, if people stop questioning authority. The role of women in these crimes also changed how history looks at responsibility. It showed that brutality isn't limited by gender. Anyone, under the right conditions, can become part of something terrible. And that is a hard truth to face.